From some shady media members running the whole ranking show to judges boosting bets to make the odds better for certain fights, here's what that super secret UFC ranking system is really all about. Let's start by talking about the media personalities that are pulling all the strings. So, if you're a UFC fanatic, then you probably know about the ranking system. You know, the one that tells you who the best fighters are in each weight class compared to the others in the same division. But let's face it, we really don't know anything about it. Like, who's in charge of making the rankings? What qualifies a fighter to be ranked? Who makes the rules? Well, basically, a group of random journalists from a bunch of networks make up the panel that decides the rankings. They cast their votes for each fighter, and the results are then tallied up to create the official UFC rankings. But wait, did you know that they only propped this thing up back in February 2013? Yeah, that's right. And believe it or not, but the system was actually made because of public outrage. Fans were really mad when Nick Diaz was booked for a title shot against Georges St-Pierre. Now, Diaz was coming off an interim title loss to Carlos Condit, and he hadn't won a single fight in a year and a half.
35 seconds. Condit's on top of him.
It wasn't the first time a fighter was given a title shot after a loss, and fans were not happy. So that's when the UFC decided to introduce the ranking system. It was a way to calm the fans down, people who wanted to know the reasoning behind those matches. They acted like they were doing us a favor back then, because nobody ever bothered to explain how the system really works. So how about we dive a little deeper into how the rankings are decided? We know that members of the media cast the votes that determine the official rankings, but who exactly are these people? Well, according to the UFC's official statement on their rankings page, the voting panel is made up of media members. Yeah, that's it. It doesn't mention who these people really are. All we know is that these guys are asked to vote for the top fighters in each weight class and pound for pound rankings. So the rankings are basically an average of the votes cast by these guys. They can vote for any fighter who is currently active on the UFC roster and can even include a fighter in several weight divisions. But there's one exception to the rule. Champions and interim champions are always in the first and second spots because their champion status already labels them as the best in their weight class. And nobody wants to mess with that unless they want to get caught in 4K. So that naturally brings up the question, has anyone been caught yet? Well, let's face the facts. These guys are really good at working in the shadows. And unfortunately, the UFC keeps a tight lid on who gets to vote on rankings and what criteria they use. The whole process is super secret, and the UFC never reveals who the voters are or how they are selected. And this lack of transparency is a major red flag because it means that the results can be manipulated, which is not good news for fighters. Seriously, even if you check out the UFC rankings page, hoping to get some info on who voted for what, you're gonna have zero luck. After all, they only show the official rankings after the votes are in, but don't sweat it. They still show the outlets that do the voting, just not the actual people calling the shots. And honestly, some of those media outlets have no clue about MMA and have been called out for it. Like, some aren't even related to MMA at all. Plus, some of the voters used to work in the MMA world, but not anymore. How am I so sure? Well, a few years back, a Reddit user named Gypsy Gold leaked some info on these mystery folks. And let me tell you, some of these guys are sketchy as hell. First off, we've got Burstback, a freaking shoe company. Like, what do they know about MMA rankings? Then there's Christopher Esping, who only has 39 Twitter followers. Excuse me, how are we supposed to trust this dude? But that's not all. It gets even worse, my friends. MMA odds breakers Brian Heminger works for a legit odds maker. That's a major conflict of interest if you ask me. And don't even get me started on the MMA Weekly guys. Jeff Kane never updates his rankings, and Ken Pishna is a straight-up UFC shill. The thread then says that the UFC recently added some new panelists to the mix, but it was still pretty suspect. Like, who the hell is Jazer Davari? And it mentions someone named Asha Tafari, someone with only 13 freaking followers on Twitter. I mean, come on. All in all, the thread makes the rankings look like a total joke. And with panelists like these, it's no wonder they're so messed up. But I'm glad that people are finally taking notice. Like in the same thread, another user made a really interesting point. They said that the UFC's business model is similar to that of pro wrestling, but minus predetermined match outcomes, of course. They argue that the rankings are just a tool for the UFC to control the product they are selling and justify matching up fighters based on the potential for revenue. Not gonna lie, it's not that surprising given the UFC's history of making some questionable matchups.
Beautiful follow-up to his counter with that right hand. And look, that is not Ngannou's best punch, right? That's how powerful this man is. Look at this. He's almost fading backwards as he lands that right hand, and sends Arlovsky as a...
Plus, there's this old article by My MMA News that only adds fuel to the fire. It says that there's only one rule for those panel members who rank the fighters. They gotta submit their votes within 48 hours or else they'll get booted from the panel. And the funny thing is, the article also revealed that voters' names and individual rankings used to be public knowledge, but this is no longer the case. I wonder why. It's not like this lack of transparency makes it easier for bias and ignorance to creep in, which was what basically happened with Marcelo Ruscio, a Brazilian journalist. After Conor McGregor KO'd Jose Aldo in 13 seconds at UFC 194.
Boom! Boom! It was a straight left, and Aldo connected with a left right afterwards. And he connected.
Ruscio moved McGregor down in the rankings and only dropped Aldo one spot, despite McGregor clearly deserving a higher spot. This is just unacceptable, and it just highlights the flaws in the system. No wonder why some media members have been accused of manipulating the rankings for personal gain. These guys are really sneaky about it too, but that doesn't mean that we're oblivious to how they're doing things. Like, one way they manipulate the rankings is by giving fighters their friends with a higher spot, even if they don't necessarily deserve it. That way, they can set them up with an easier fight later on and help them get closer to a title shot. And another thing they do is that they leave out certain fighters from their votes, making them rank lower than they should be. This gives the fighters they're rooting for trying to promote a chance to rank higher. Plus, to make matters worse, there's no real accountability or transparency in the process. The rules for ranking fighters aren't exactly set in stone, so these guys can kind of just do whatever they want and get away with it. But hey, let's switch targets for a bit, because this stuff goes in much, much deeper. As it turns out, judges also mess with the rankings to boost bets or make the odds better for certain fights. And let me tell you, it's crazy. They score fights in a way that favors one fighter over the other. Like, they might give more points for takedowns, even if they didn't actually do any damage. But that's not all. Another thing they do is deliberately stir up controversies, like they could give a split decision to a fighter who clearly lost the fight.
For the winner by majority decision, the notorious Conor McGregor!
This can totally screw up the rankings, and it's not always easy to tell what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that all judges are crooked or anything. They're just people, and they can make mistakes. But we definitely need to make sure they're not messing with the rankings to benefit themselves or their buddies. We need to create a fair and transparent system so that the rankings are based on real results, not what some judge thinks will make the best matchup. Oh, and the lack of diversity is another issue. Like, 75% of the media outlets are from the USA, which is really weird. And you know what else? There's a ton of bias and conflict of interest among the voters. They're all super into MMA and have connections with the fighters, so it's hard for them to be objective. That's why a mix of people inside and outside the MMA world would be the best way to go. It's important to remember that while there may be instances where the rankings are manipulated for business reasons, it's ultimately up to the fans and media to hold the UFC accountable. We need to demand fair and competitive matchups. So there you have it. From judges boosting bets to make the odds better for certain fights, to some shady media members running the whole ranking show, this was what the secret UFC ranking system is really all about.